visit the markets one by one a little later, but one question before we move there. You have been also reorganizing internally quite a lot in the process, and that's something that's not being talked about very much. And the changes that you've been doing, especially in the investment corporate banking front, consolidating that business and so on, how's that going to play out going forward? And especially because as a commercial bank playing in the investment banking space, and in a way you were a little later into that space or building that space relative to the US global investment banks, for example. And now that they are scaled back because of the crisis, and when they come back, what will that whole scenario look like in the next 2 years?
As far as we're concerned, what global banking and markets, as we call it, the business division that we have that focuses on the wholesale and institutional markets, is very broad based. Firstly, the term investment banking is always a bit of a confusing term. What does one really mean by it? That business is the business that's responsible for the range of services needed by our global corporates and global institutional clients. So it covers everything from trading activities in the markets, foreign exchange, interest rate derivatives and so forth, through transaction banking, through corporate lending, through securities business, and through advisory work. So it's a broad-based range of services. What we have been doing over the last couple of years is making sure that footprint particularly focuses on emerging markets competence. It goes back to the point I was just making. Our distinctive capability compared with a US bulge bracket house, say, is the fact that we do know about India, we do know about China, we do know about Southeast Asia, and in this day and age you're increasingly finding Indian companies, Chinese companies wanting to go outside their domestic markets, look for acquisitions and investment opportunities in other parts of the world, and vice versa. Of course, there remains a lot of foreign investor interest in those markets. For us, the opportunity, and it's a very big opportunity, is to be able to provide services to those kinds of clients. So I've been meeting with clients from the Middle East, for example, who want to understand more about China, and who know that their Chinese counterparties want to understand more about the Middle East. Our advantage is we're in both places, and what's more, have been in both places for decades, so we're deeply rooted in both places, so we can provide real services. That's our opportunity. What we should not be doing is competing toe-to-toe with a Goldman Sachs in the domestic US market in investment banking or corporate advisory work.
And when the Goldman Sachs and the JP Morgans come back into the global marketplace, what is your reading in terms of how they're going to look like going forward, especially now that they have to incorporate as commercial banks?
I think it's hard to tell yet, but it is clear that the phenomenon of very high leverage, which pervaded not just the narrowly defined investment banks, but much more generally the banking industry in recent years, is a thing of the past. Neither the regulators nor actually the market is going to tolerate as much of the very high leverage as was around in the early years of this decade. So those that have made profits and produced high returns on equity and considerable growth in those go-go years, as you might call them, based on high leverage and complex product structuring and that kind of business formula, are going to have to find new business models. I suspect that the new business model is going to look in many ways like the older business models of commercial banking and good old-fashioned, if I can use that term, investment banking, where there was a strong component of private equity commitment. The old merchant banking concept, if you will come back into fashion.
Well, even as it comes back into fashion, the competition for talent is probably going to be the same in that way. So, and HSBC's challenge on that front was the compensation structures that you had in place.
Well, I think the question of compensation is an industry-wide one now, and one which both the regulators and indeed politicians are focusing on. I think it's unclear what levels of compensation will persist in the industry.
My interest is specifically in the investment banking.
Mine too. I would part company slightly with the way you put it. We've actually run compensation practices within our trading businesses, which are market competitive. Of course, you have to. If you want to be successful, you have to compete with the market. There is no doubt that regulators are going to require What I think the best practice probably always has been, that is more deferral of compensation into stock of the company in order to align the interests of traders with the interests of shareholders more carefully than has been the case in recent years. I am sure that regulators will persist with requiring that. I don't think regulators will intervene on the quantum of compensation. They will say that is a market matter. But undoubtedly they will want to see compensation structured in a way that aligns trading or transactional activity with the longer term risk that the shareholder and indeed the system faces as a result of their activities.
Let me tap your thinking on how do you think the global players are going to shape up? What seems to be happening today is you have the US model of global players, the Citis, the JP Morgan Chase and players like that. You've got the Anglo-Saxon English or the British model, which the Lloyds, the RBSs, who will be reformed, going forward. Interestingly, there are the European players now. You've got the new Spanish players. You've got the Santanders, the BBVAs, and so on. Give us a sense of who your future peers are going to look like, and where will they come from?
That's an interesting question. In some senses, it's hard to identify another bank that's exactly the same as we are.
Okay.
For one thing, we're very large. We are the largest bank by market cap in the world. We're in 85 countries. We have a very strong, internationally connected commercial banking business. We have nearly 3 million business banking customers around the world. This is an order of magnitude bigger than any other bank in terms of the sheer international spread of that business. Having said that, when you look at any given market where we operate, there are, of course, very strong and respected competitors. Standard Chartered has a footprint in Asia and the Middle East, not dissimilar to ours. In any given country, there are very strong local competitors. In India, we compete strongly with the likes of ICICI, and indeed they're very much bigger than we are in India. So you have to look at this market by market rather than globally. Our proposition is a very unusual one, or almost a unique one, the international connectivity with a strong emerging markets footprint. I happen to believe that that's one that plays to the way the global macroeconomy is evolving. It's a very unusual one. There is no other bank that's exactly the same as us.
How then